I was standing in my kitchen making coffee when I saw the white Range Rover pull into my driveway, and I knew immediately this was going to be one of those days. The vehicle belonged to Deborah Hastings, president of the Pinewood Ridge Homeowners Association, and she only made house calls when she wanted to deliver bad news personally. I watched through the window as she stepped out, her sensible heels clicking against the frozen concrete, a manila folder clutched in her perfectly manicured hands. I lived in Pinewood Ridge, a development just outside Bozeman, Montana, where the houses were spaced far enough apart that you could pretend you had privacy, but close enough that the HOA could monitor your every move. I had bought my property 3 years ago, a decent 5-acre plot with a house that needed work, but had good bones. The previous owner, an elderly man named Harold, had been happy to sell when his arthritis got too bad for Montana winters. Deborah knocked on my door with the kind of authority that suggested she believed she owned the place. I took my time answering, letting my coffee finish brewing first. When I finally opened the door, she was already wearing that tight-lipped smile that meant trouble. "Marcus, good morning," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I hope I am not catching you at a bad time." "What can I do for you, Deborah?" I asked, not bothering to invite her in. The February cold swept through the doorway, but I figured this would be quick. She opened the manila folder with theatrical precision. "I'm afraid I have to deliver some unfortunate news. The HOA board held an emergency meeting last night and we have issued you a fine." I felt my jaw tighten. "A fine? For what?" "Snowmobile tracks," she said, pulling out a series of printed photographs. "These were taken 3 days ago after that big snowfall we had. As you can see, there are clear snowmobile tracks running through several properties in our development, including across the Hendersons' yard, the Mitchell's property, and the Commons area near the entrance. The tracks are unsightly, damage the landscape, and violate our community standards." I took the photos from her hand and examined them. Sure enough, there were snowmobile tracks cutting through pristine snow, but something did not add up. "Deborah, I do not own a snowmobile." She gave me a pitying look, the kind you would give a child caught in an obvious lie. "Marcus, we have 3 witnesses who saw a snowmobile leaving your property that morning. The tracks originate from your land." "That is impossible," I said, studying the photos more carefully. "I mean, yes, someone might have crossed my property, but it was not me." "Regardless of who was driving, the snowmobile came from your property, which makes you responsible. Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the HOA bylaws clearly states that homeowners are liable for any vehicles, guests, or activities originating from their premises." She pointed to another page in her folder, highlighting the relevant text. "The fine is $1,500, due within 30 days, $1,500. I felt heat rising in my chest despite the cold air. This is ridiculous. "I did not ride any snowmobile. I do not own a snowmobile, and I am not paying a fine for something I did not do." Deborah's smile tightened further. "I understand your frustration, but the bylaws are very clear. If you wish to appeal, you may submit a formal request to the board, but the fine stands until the appeal is resolved. You will receive official documentation in the mail within 3 business days." She tucked the folder under her arm. "I suggest you better monitor the activities on your property, Marcus. This is a family-friendly community, and we cannot have people tearing up the landscape with recreational vehicles." Before I could respond, she turned and walked back to her Range Rover, leaving me standing in the doorway with my blood pressure rising. I closed the door and looked at the photos again. The tracks definitely crossed multiple properties, cutting a path that seemed to snake through the development. But why would anyone think they came from my land? I grabbed my coat and boots and headed outside. The snow from 3 days ago had been partially melted by a brief warm spell, then frozen again, creating a crusty surface. I walked the perimeter of my property, looking for any signs of snowmobile activity. My land was shaped like an irregular polygon, with the house sitting toward the front, and the back portion extending into a wooded area that I had largely left untouched. As I walked toward the back of my property, I found them. Snowmobile tracks, now hardened into icy ruts, cutting through my land. They came from the woods beyond my property line and crossed through my back acreage before heading toward the development. I followed them carefully, my boots crunching on the frozen snow. The tracks definitely came from beyond my property. I pulled out my phone and took several photos, making sure to capture the direction and origin point. This was not someone leaving from my house or garage. This was someone using my land as a shortcut to access the development. I needed to figure out where my property actually ended. When I bought the place, I had received a survey, but I had not paid much attention to the exact boundaries beyond the immediate area around the house. I went back inside and dug through my filing cabinet until I found the property survey from 3 years ago. Spreading it out on my kitchen table, I studied the boundaries carefully. My property was larger than I had realized. The back portion extended well into what I had assumed was just communal woods. According to the survey, I owned a significant strip of forested land that bordered not just the HOA development, but also connected to the county road on the other side. I grabbed my laptop and pulled up the county property records online. After some searching, I found the official plat map for the area. My stomach did a small flip as I traced the boundaries. The access road that led into Pinewood Ridge, the main entrance that every resident used to get to their homes, cut directly through my property. Not just touching the edge of it, but going straight through about 200 feet of land that I legally owned. This made no sense. How could the HOA have built a road through my property without an easement? I dug deeper into the documents from my home purchase. There was an easement mentioned, granted by the previous owner Harold to the developer when Pinewood Ridge was first built. But as I read the fine print, I noticed something interesting. The easement was personal to Harold, not attached to the property itself. It was granted in 1998 with specific language. Harold Winters grants permission for access during his lifetime and ownership. Harold had sold me the property in 2023, which meant, unless I was misreading this, that the easement had expired when Harold transferred ownership to me. The HOA had no legal right to use my land for access. I sat back in my chair, processing this information. The entire Pinewood Ridge development, with its 40-plus homes, used that access road every single day. Without it, there was no other way to reach the properties. The development backed up against national forest land on one side and my property on the other. The county road only connected to my land. I needed to talk to a lawyer, but my mind was already racing ahead. Deborah had just fined me $1,500 for snowmobile tracks that did not even originate from my activities. Tracks that crossed my land without permission, just like every single resident of Pinewood Ridge did every single day. The next morning, I called a property attorney in Bozeman named Richard Chen. His secretary scheduled me for an appointment that afternoon, marked as urgent. I gathered all my documents, the property survey, the deed, the title report, and the easement documentation. Richard's office was in a modern building downtown, all glass and steel. He was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes that immediately focused on the documents I spread across his conference table. "Talk me through what you have got," he said, pulling out a legal pad. I explained the situation, the HOA fine, the snowmobile tracks, and my discovery about the property boundaries and the access road. Richard listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes. When I finished, he spent several minutes carefully reading through the easement document. Finally, he looked up. This is pretty clear. The easement was personal to Harold Winters. It terminated when he sold the property. So the HOA has been using my land illegally for 3 years. Technically, yes, though they may not have realized it. These kinds of things can slip through the cracks, especially if the HOA assumed the easement ran with the land rather than being personal to the grantor. He tapped his pen against the pad. The question is, what do you want to do about it? Can I revoke their access? Richard leaned back in his chair. You can. It is your property, and they do not have a legal right to use it without an easement or your permission. However, I need to be clear about what that would mean. You would be cutting off access to 40-some homes. The residents would have to find another way in and out, or the HOA would have to negotiate an easement with you. What would that negotiation look like? Typically, the HOA would pay you for the easement. Given that you are providing the only access to a 40-home development, we are talking about significant value. I would estimate somewhere in the range of $200,000 to $400,000, possibly more. I let out a low whistle. That much. Your land is the only thing standing between those homeowners and being completely landlocked. That is valuable. Plus, if we are factoring in 3 years of unauthorized use, we could potentially add damages to the negotiation. He smiled slightly. Though I would recommend taking a more diplomatic approach initially. Send them a letter explaining the situation and giving them time to respond before taking any drastic action. I thought about Deborah standing on my doorstep with her smug smile and her $1,500 fine. What if I just revoke access immediately? That is your legal right, but it would create chaos and likely end up in court. The HOA might argue adverse possession or prescriptive easement. Would they win? Unlikely. 3 years is not long enough for adverse possession in Montana, which requires 5 years. And for a prescriptive easement, they would need to prove their use was open, notorious, continuous, and adverse to your rights. If they believed they had a valid easement, that works against the adverse element. He paused. But litigation is expensive and time-consuming. I am not saying do not play hardball, but consider giving them notice first. I shook my head. They fined me $1,500 for snowmobile tracks that were not even my fault. Someone used my land as a shortcut, just like they have all been doing for years, and they want to penalize me for it. Richard was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. I understand the frustration. If you want to revoke access immediately, here is what I recommend. I will draft a letter clearly stating that you are revoking any implied permission for use of your land, citing the expired easement. We will send it certified mail to the HOA board and post copies at both ends of the access road. That gives them legal notice. After that, if they continue to use your land, they are trespassing. How quickly can you draft that letter? I can have it ready by tomorrow morning. Do it, I said. That evening, I could not stop thinking about what I was about to do. Part of me wondered if I was being petty, retaliating against Deborah and the HOA board over a fine that, while unfair, was not going to bankrupt me. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like a matter of principle. They had been using my land for years without permission or compensation, and the moment they thought I had caused a minor inconvenience, they slapped me with a penalty. I called my younger brother Jake in Billings. He worked in construction and had a practical mindset that I valued. You are seriously going to cut off access to an entire neighborhood? He asked after I explained the situation. They do not have a right to use my property, Jake. The easement expired. Yeah, but Marcus, that is 40 families. Kids, elderly people, working folks who need to get in and out. You are going to make enemies. They already made me an enemy when they fined me for something I did not do, Jake sighed. I get it, man, but maybe there is a middle ground. Like, tell them about the easement problem and negotiate from there. That was my lawyer's suggestion too. But I think they need to understand they made a mistake. They need to feel some consequences before they will take me seriously. Just be careful. People do crazy things when they feel cornered. We talked for a few more minutes before hanging up. Jake's warning stuck with me, but I had made my decision. The next morning, Richard emailed me the draft letter. It was beautifully formal and legally airtight, explaining that the easement granted by Harold Winters had been personal and had terminated upon sale, that I was hereby revoking any implied permission for use of my land, and that continued use would constitute trespassing. Send it, I emailed back. By Friday afternoon, the letters had been sent certified mail to the HOA board members, including Deborah, and I had posted laminated copies at both ends of the access road where it crossed my property. I also installed a chain across the road with a large "No Trespassing Private Property" sign. Then I waited. The first call came at 6:15 that evening. It was Robert Henderson, one of my neighbors who lived toward the back of the development. "Marcus, what the hell is going on?" he demanded. "There is a chain across the access road." "That road crosses my private property without a valid easement," I said calmly. "I have revoked permission for its use. You cannot just block off the road. How are we supposed to get home? That is something you will need to work out with the HOA. This is insane. My wife is stuck on the other side of your chain with a car full of groceries." I felt a pang of guilt about that. "I will come down and let her through this one time, but after tonight, the access is closed." I drove down to the chain in my truck. Mrs. Henderson was indeed waiting in her Subaru, looking confused and frustrated. I unlocked the chain and let her through, then secured it again. She did not say anything to me, just drove past with a tight expression. My phone rang continuously for the next 2 hours. Different residents, all angry or bewildered. I gave them the same explanation each time. Around 9 p.m., Deborah called. "Marcus Fitzroy, what do you think you are doing?" Her voice had lost all pretense of sweetness. "Exercising my property rights, Deborah. You cannot block access to an entire community." "I am not blocking anything. I am simply not allowing unauthorized use of my private property. If you review the documents I sent, you will see that the easement your development has been relying on expired when Harold Winters sold me the property." There was a long pause. "That is ridiculous. We have been using that road for decades, under a personal easement that no longer exists. If the HOA wants to negotiate a new easement, you are welcome to contact my attorney." I gave her Richard's information. "You are doing this because of the fine, are you not? This is retaliation. This is about property rights. You fined me for snowmobile tracks that crossed my land without my permission." It made me take a closer look at exactly where my property lines are and who else has been crossing my land without permission. Turns out, it is everyone in Pinewood Ridge. "We will sue you," Deborah threatened. "You are welcome to try. My attorney is confident about our position. In the meantime, the chain stays up." She hung up without another word. Saturday morning brought more chaos. I watched from my front window as cars began backing up at the chain. Some residents tried calling me. Others apparently tried to go around through the woods, though the terrain made that essentially impossible. By noon, there were at least a dozen cars parked along the county road, their occupants standing around in clusters, talking on phones and gesturing toward my property. A sheriff's deputy arrived around 1 p.m. I had been expecting this. Deputy Martinez was young and polite, and he looked somewhat uncomfortable as I invited him inside. "Sir, I have had multiple complaints about you blocking access to Pinewood Ridge," he said. "I am not blocking anything, Deputy. I am preventing trespassing on my private property." I showed him the survey, the expired easement, and the letter from my attorney. He spent several minutes reviewing the documents. "This seems like a civil matter, sir," he finally said. "If you own the land and there is no valid easement, you have the right to control access." That is what my attorney said. I have to ask, though, is there any way you can work something out with the HOA? There are a lot of people who cannot get to their homes. I am happy to negotiate an easement. They can contact my attorney. Deputy Martinez nodded slowly. "All right. I will let the residents know this is a civil issue and they need to work with the HOA to resolve it." He paused at the door. "Just be aware, people are pretty upset." "You might want to be careful." After he left, I called Richard. "The sheriff was just here. He confirmed it is a civil matter." "Good, that is what we want. How is the HOA responding?" Lots of angry phone calls. Deborah threatened to sue. "Let them." In the meantime, they are going to feel pressure from the residents. Every day that chain stays up, it is going to cost the HOA in terms of goodwill and potential liability. I would bet they reach out to negotiate within 48 hours. Richard was wrong. It took 6 hours. At 7 p.m., I received a call from a number I did not recognize. It was Lawrence Mitchell, a real estate attorney who identified himself as counsel for the Pinewood Ridge HOA. "Mr. Fitzroy, I understand there is a dispute regarding access to my client's development." "No dispute," I said. "Just a matter of property rights. I have reviewed the documents your attorney provided. While the language of the original easement is somewhat ambiguous, my clients believe they have a valid claim to continued access based on historical use. Your clients are welcome to make that argument in court. In the meantime, the access is closed." Lawrence was quiet for a moment. "What would it take for you to reopen access while we negotiate?" "A retraction of the $1,500 fine your clients issued me, along with a written apology, and a good faith payment of $10,000 toward the eventual easement cost." I heard him take a breath. "That is quite a demand." "That is my offer. Take it or leave it." Every day that access stays closed, my number goes up. I will need to consult with my clients. You do that. Sunday morning was quiet. I assumed the HOA board was meeting to discuss their options. I used the time to do more research on property easements and access rights. Everything I read confirmed what Richard had told me. I was on solid legal ground. Around 2 p.m., my phone rang. It was Lawrence again. My clients agreed to retract the fine and provide a written apology. However, they feel that $10,000 is excessive for temporary access during negotiations. "Then I guess we do not have a deal." "Mr. Fitzroy, please be reasonable. You are holding 40 families hostage over a misunderstanding." "I am not holding anyone hostage." Your clients built a development that relies on access through private property without securing proper easements. That is their problem, not mine. What if we agree to $5,000? I almost laughed. You think my property is worth $5,000 to provide sole access to a 40-home development? Lawrence, my attorney estimates the easement value at $200,000 to $400,000. $10,000 for temporary access while we negotiate is incredibly generous. There was a long silence. "I will need to speak with my clients again." "You do that, and tell them the price goes up to $15,000 at midnight tonight." I hung up, my heart pounding. I was not sure if I was being smart or stupid, but there was something exhilarating about finally having the upper hand with the HOA. At 8 p.m., Lawrence called back. "My clients agree to your terms. They will retract the fine, provide a written apology, and pay $10,000 for temporary access while we negotiate a permanent easement agreement. However, they insist that the $10,000 be credited toward the final easement cost." Agreed. Draft the paperwork and have it to my attorney by tomorrow morning. Once everything is signed and the payment clears, I will remove the chain. Thank you, Mr. Fitzroy. Monday afternoon, Richard called to confirm that the agreement had been signed and the payment had been wired to his trust account. The written apology from the HOA was brief but satisfactory, acknowledging that the fine had been issued in error. I drove down to the access road and removed the chain. Cars began streaming through within minutes. I did not stick around to hear what anyone had to say. I figured I had made enough enemies for 1 week. Over the next 2 weeks, Lawrence and Richard began negotiating the permanent easement. The HOA's initial offer was $75,000. Richard countered at $350,000. We eventually settled on $220,000, plus the HOA would be responsible for maintaining the portion of the road that crossed my property. The agreement was finalized in early March. The HOA arranged financing through a special assessment on all the homeowners in the development. I heard through the grapevine that this did not make me popular, but I did not particularly care. I had not asked them to build a development that depended entirely on access through my land. With the money from the easement, I paid off my mortgage and put the rest into savings and investments. The whole situation had gone from insulting to lucrative in the span of a few weeks. But the story did not end there. In mid-March, I got a call from the county sheriff's office. A detective named Sarah Ortega asked if she could come by to ask me some questions. I agreed, curious about what this was about. Detective Ortega arrived the next morning with Deputy Martinez. They both looked serious as I invited them into my kitchen. "Mr. Fitzroy, we are investigating an incident that occurred in February," Detective Ortega began. "You reported concerns about snowmobile tracks crossing your property. Is that correct?" "Well, the HOA fined me for them, but yes, there were tracks crossing my land." "Can you show me where?" I walked them out to the back portion of my property where the tracks had been. The snow had mostly melted now, but the damaged ground was still visible in places. "Did you ever figure out who was riding the snowmobile?" she asked. "No. I assumed it was someone from the development or maybe from the county roadside. We have been investigating a series of burglaries in this area, rural properties mostly. The perpetrators have been using snowmobiles to access properties through wooded areas where they would not be noticed." My stomach tightened. "You think whoever left those tracks was involved in burglaries?" "We do. We have been tracking the pattern of the thefts and the snowmobile routes. Your property appears to have been used as a transit corridor." She pulled out a map marked with various colored pins. "These red pins are burglary sites. The blue line represents the snowmobile tracks we have been able to document. Notice how they pass directly through your back property." I studied the map. The blue line cut right through where I had found the tracks. "Have you caught anyone?" "Not yet. But we are close. We have identified a suspect who owns property adjacent to the National Forest land behind you. We are working on getting a warrant." She paused. "The reason I am here is that we might need to access your property to conduct surveillance. Would you be willing to cooperate?" "Of course. Whatever you need." Over the next week, I saw unmarked vehicles parked at various points around my property. Detective Ortega checked in with me periodically to let me know how things were progressing. Apparently, the suspect was a man named Travis Cole who lived about 2 miles away and had a history of theft charges. He and an accomplice had been using snowmobiles to access rural properties, stealing equipment, tools, and anything else they could carry. The breakthrough came when deputies caught Travis and his friend Jeremy in the act of burglarizing a barn 4 miles north of me. They had followed the snowmobile tracks in reverse and set up a stakeout. Both men were arrested and charged with multiple counts of burglary. In early April, Detective Ortega came by one last time to update me. Travis Cole has been pleading out. He confessed to 17 burglaries over the past 2 years. His route took him right through your property and into the Pinewood Ridge development. Some of the tracks that the HOA fined you for were definitely his. I shook my head in disbelief. So the HOA fined me for tracks left by criminals? Essentially, yes. I have documented all of this in my report. If you wanted to pursue any legal action against the HOA for the false accusation, you would have strong evidence. I thought about it, but decided against it. I had already gotten my money from the easement. Pursuing the HOA further felt like overkill. What I did not expect was the HOA to pursue me. In late April, I received a letter from Lawrence, the HOA's attorney. The letter stated that the HOA board had reviewed the circumstances surrounding the February fine and the subsequent access dispute. While they acknowledged that the fine had been issued in error, they believed that my response had been disproportionate and had caused unnecessary hardship to the residents of Pinewood Ridge. The letter went on to say that the HOA was considering filing a lawsuit seeking to reduce the easement payment, arguing that I had negotiated under duress by blocking access to the community. I immediately forwarded the letter to Richard. He called me an hour later, and he sounded angry. "This is absurd," he said. "They signed a legally binding agreement. You cannot just come back later and claim duress because you do not like the price you agreed to." Can they actually sue? They can file a lawsuit, sure. Anyone can file anything, but they would lose. They had legal representation during the negotiation. No one forced them to sign. And blocking access to your own property to enforce your rights does not constitute duress in the legal sense. So what do we do? I will respond on your behalf, making it very clear that any attempt to relitigate the easement agreement will be met with a countersuit for harassment and abuse of process. That should shut this down. Richard sent his response, and for a few weeks, things were quiet. Then in mid-May, I received a summons. The HOA had actually filed a lawsuit claiming duress, unconscionable contract terms, and seeking to void the easement agreement. I met with Richard in his office. He seemed more annoyed than worried. They are making a mistake. This is going to cost them a lot of money in legal fees, and they are going to lose. How long will this take? Depends on how aggressively they want to pursue it. Could be months, could be over a year. He leaned back in his chair. Here is my advice. We file a counterclaim for harassment and abuse of process. We also add a claim for attorney's fees. That might encourage them to settle quickly. We filed the counterclaim, and the case began to wind through the court system. Discovery was tedious. The HOA demanded all kinds of documents, and we responded with our own requests. The more I learned through discovery, the more troubled I became about how the HOA operated. It turned out that Deborah had a history of issuing questionable fines. Multiple homeowners had been cited for minor violations, often based on subjective interpretations of the bylaws. One family had been fined for having a garden gnome that was supposedly too tall. Another had been cited for parking a work van in their driveway overnight. The fines added up to thousands of dollars in revenue for the HOA each year. More concerning was what I discovered about the access road situation. Internal HOA emails, produced during discovery, showed that Deborah and several board members had been aware that the easement might be problematic. A lawyer had raised concerns about it during a review of HOA documents in 2021, but the board had decided not to address it because they thought it was unlikely anyone would challenge the arrangement. In other words, they had knowingly been using my property without a valid easement and had gambled that I would not find out or care. Richard seized on this in our legal filings. "This is bad faith," he explained. "They knew there was a problem with the easement and chose to ignore it." That undermines their entire duress argument. The case was scheduled for a hearing in August. The judge assigned to the case was Helen Morrison, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with a reputation for efficiency. The hearing took place on a hot Monday morning. I sat with Richard at the plaintiff's table while Lawrence and Deborah sat across from us. Several other HOA board members were in the gallery. Judge Morrison reviewed the filings carefully before looking up. "Let me see if I understand this correctly." The HOA issued a fine to Mr. Fitzroy for snowmobile tracks on various properties. Mr. Fitzroy investigated and discovered that the HOA's access road crosses his property without a valid easement. He blocked access, and the parties negotiated an agreement. Now the HOA wants to void that agreement, claiming duress. "That is correct, Your Honor," Lawrence said. "Our position is that Mr. Fitzroy took advantage of an emergency situation to extract an unconscionable payment." Judge Morrison turned to Richard. "Counselor." "Your Honor, there was no emergency except the one created by the HOA's own failure to secure proper easements. Mr. Fitzroy was within his rights to block access to his property. The HOA was represented by competent counsel during negotiations. They agreed to the terms freely. And as our counterclaim demonstrates, the HOA was actually aware of the easement problem before any of this occurred and chose to ignore it." The judge looked at Deborah. "Is that true? Were you aware of concerns about the easement before this dispute?" Deborah shifted uncomfortably. "We had been advised that the language was somewhat ambiguous." "Ambiguous or invalid?" The attorney we consulted said there could be an argument either way. Judge Morrison did not look pleased. "So you knew there was a potential problem, did nothing about it, and then when Mr. Fitzroy enforced his property rights, you negotiated an agreement that you now want to void." "Your Honor, we represent the interests of 40 families," Lawrence interjected. "The cost of the easement is being passed on to them through a special assessment. Many of these families are struggling with the financial burden. That is unfortunate, but it does not constitute duress in the legal sense." Judge Morrison flipped through the documents again. "I am looking at the emails produced in discovery. Miss Hastings, you sent an email in March 2021 that says, and I quote, 'We should probably address the easement situation before it becomes a problem, but I do not want to open that can of worms right now.' Is that correct?" Deborah's face flushed. "I may have said that, but I did not think it would actually become an issue." "But it did become an issue, and when it did, you negotiated a resolution. You do not get to undo that resolution just because you do not like the outcome." The judge closed the file. The HOA's claim for duress is denied. The easement agreement stands. Furthermore, I am granting Mr. Fitzroy's counterclaim for attorney's fees. The HOA will be responsible for his legal costs in defending this action. Lawrence stood quickly. "Your Honor, we would like to request a stay to consider an appeal. You can file whatever motions you want, Counselor, but I would advise your clients to cut their losses. This case is not getting any better for them." She banged her gavel. "We are adjourned." I walked out of the courthouse feeling vindicated but exhausted. Richard was grinning. That went well. How much can we get for attorney's fees? I will bill my actual time. Probably around $30,000 given how much work this case has required. The HOA did not appeal. 2 weeks later, they paid Richard's fees. I thought that would finally be the end of it, but September brought another twist. I received a call from a woman named Patricia Brennan. She identified herself as a homeowner in Pinewood Ridge and asked if she could meet with me. Curious, I agreed. Patricia was in her 50s, with tired eyes and a nervous manner. We met at a coffee shop in Bozeman. She ordered a latte and spent a few minutes making small talk before getting to the point. I wanted to thank you, she said, for standing up to the HOA. I appreciate that, but I was mostly just protecting my own interests. Maybe, but you exposed a lot of problems in how the HOA operates. After the lawsuit, several of us started looking more carefully at the board's activities. What we found was troubling. She pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Inside were financial statements, emails, and bank records. We think Deborah has been embezzling from the HOA. I looked up sharply. Embezzling. The HOA collects around $50,000 a year in fees from the homeowners, plus fines, special assessments, and other revenue. The money is supposed to go toward maintenance, landscaping, and communal expenses. But we have been going through the records, and there are a lot of unexplained withdrawals and payments to vendors that do not seem legitimate. I flipped through the documents. There were payments to a landscaping company called Green Valley Services, but Patricia had highlighted notes showing that no actual landscaping work had been done on the dates listed. There were consulting fees paid to a company called Summit Management, but no one seemed to know what services they provided. Have you reported this to the authorities? Not yet. We wanted to gather more evidence first. But we thought you should know, given everything you went through with the HOA. I studied the documents more carefully. Why are you bringing this to me? Because you have a lawyer who knows how to deal with the HOA. And because we thought you might want to see Deborah face some consequences for what she put you through. I took the folder home and called Richard. He reviewed the documents and agreed they looked suspicious. If there is actual embezzlement going on, this is criminal. You would need to report it to law enforcement. Would that help with anything related to my case? Your case is resolved. But if you are asking whether exposing fraud in the HOA would be satisfying, I imagine it would be. I thought about it for a day before calling Patricia back. I think you need to go to the police with this. If Deborah has been stealing from the HOA, that is a crime, and she should be held accountable. Patricia and several other homeowners filed a report with the sheriff's office in late September. Detective Ortega, the same detective who had worked on the burglary case, was assigned to investigate. She called me in early October. Mr. Fitzroy, I understand you have some information related to the Pinewood Ridge HOA investigation. Some homeowners brought me documents. I passed them on to my attorney, who suggested they go to law enforcement. We have been reviewing the HOA's financial records. It looks like there are significant discrepancies. Can you come in and give a formal statement about your interactions with the HOA? I went to the sheriff's office and spent 2 hours going through everything that had happened, from the initial fine to the lawsuit. Detective Ortega took detailed notes. This helps establish a pattern of behavior, she said. Thank you for your cooperation. The investigation took months. During that time, the Pinewood Ridge HOA board suspended Deborah pending the outcome of the investigation. An interim president, a retired accountant named George Walsh, took over and began working to clean up the HOA's finances. In January of the following year, Deborah was arrested and charged with theft and embezzlement. The total amount she had allegedly stolen was over $90,000 over a 5-year period. She had been creating fake invoices from shell companies she controlled and paying herself for services that were never rendered. The case went to trial in April. I was called as a witness to testify about the fine I had received and the subsequent dispute. The prosecutor used my case as an example of how Deborah had abused her position, issuing fines to generate revenue that she then embezzled. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The evidence against Deborah was overwhelming. The jury convicted her on all counts. In June, she was sentenced to 4 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. Standing outside the courthouse after the sentencing, I ran into Patricia and several other Pinewood Ridge residents. They looked relieved. "Thank you," Patricia said. "If you had not fought back against that fine, we might never have started looking into the HOA's finances." "I was just protecting my property," I said. "But I am glad something good came out of it." George Walsh, the interim president, approached me. "Mr. Fitzroy, I want to apologize on behalf of the HOA for everything you went through. The fine, the lawsuit, all of it. That was not how a homeowners association should operate." "I appreciate that, George. I also want you to know that we have completely restructured how the HOA operates. We now have independent financial audits, term limits for board members, and a transparent appeals process for fines. We are trying to rebuild trust with the homeowners." That sounds like a good start. Life slowly returned to normal after that. The easement payment had given me financial security I had not had before. I used some of the money to make improvements to my house, repairs I had been putting off. I also invested in a good fence along the back portion of my property to clearly mark the boundaries. The residents of Pinewood Ridge gradually stopped treating me like a pariah. Some even became friendly. Robert Henderson, whose wife I had let through the chain that first night, stopped by one afternoon with a 6-pack of beer. "I wanted to apologize," he said. "I was pretty angry that night, but I understand now why you did what you did." "No hard feelings," I said, accepting the beer. We sat on my porch and talked for a while. He told me about the changes in the HOA, how much better things were with George in charge. "It is like a different community now. People actually like living there again." "I am glad to hear that. For what it is worth, I think what you did took guts. Deborah had been running that HOA like her personal fiefdom for years. Someone needed to stand up to her." As summer arrived, I found myself reflecting on the entire experience. It had started with an unfair fine and had ended with a criminal conviction. I had not set out to expose corruption or reform an HOA. I had just wanted to protect my property rights. But sometimes standing up for yourself has ripple effects you do not anticipate. One evening in July, I was sitting on my porch watching the sunset when my phone rang. It was Jake, my brother. "Hey, I have been following the news about your HOA situation," he said. "Sounds like it finally wrapped up." "Yeah, Deborah is in prison and the HOA is under new management. I have got to say, Marcus, when you told me you were going to block access to that development, I thought you were being crazy. But you were right. They needed to be held accountable. I just wish it had not taken so long. Sometimes justice takes time, but it sounds like you made a real difference. Those homeowners are better off now because you stood your ground." We talked for a while longer, catching up on family news. After we hung up, I sat on the porch for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened. The snowmobile tracks that had started it all, the discovery about the easement, the standoff over access, the lawsuit, and finally the criminal investigation. In a weird way, I was grateful for that initial fine. If Deborah had not tried to punish me for something I did not do, I might never have looked closely at my property boundaries. I might never have discovered the easement issue or negotiated a payment that secured my financial future. And the homeowners of Pinewood Ridge might still be under the thumb of a corrupt HOA president. Sometimes the worst things that happen to you end up leading to the best outcomes. You just have to be willing to stand up for yourself and see it through. As fall arrived and the leaves began to turn, I noticed more wildlife on my property. Deer, elk, even a moose one morning. The back portion of my land, the part that had caused so much trouble, was actually quite beautiful. I started taking walks back there in the evenings, enjoying the solitude and the views. One afternoon in October, I was walking the property line when I encountered a man I did not recognize. He was older, probably in his 70s, with white hair and weathered features. He was standing at the edge of my property, looking toward the woods. "Can I help you?" I asked. He turned and smiled. "You must be Marcus. I am Harold Winters. I used to own this land." I shook his hand, surprised. "Mr. Winters, it is good to meet you. I bought your property 3 years ago." "I know. I have been following the news about what happened with the HOA. I wanted to come by and apologize." "Apologize? For what?" "For not being clearer about the easement situation when I sold you the property. I granted that access to the developer back in 1998 as a personal favor. I never thought about what would happen when I sold the land. I should have addressed it before the sale." "It worked out all right in the end," I said. "I heard. $220,000, the news said. That is good money." He looked around the property. "I lived here for 40 years, raised my kids here. I loved this land, but the winters got to be too much for my arthritis. Had to move south to Arizona. It is a beautiful property." "It is. I am glad it went to someone who was willing to stand up for it. That HOA tried to push me around a few times too, back when Deborah first became president. Wanted me to trim trees on my property because they blocked someone's view. I told her where she could stick her tree trimming request." He chuckled. "I think that is why I made the easement personal rather than attaching it to the land. I did not want to give them any more control than necessary." We walked the property together for a while, Harold pointing out features and telling me stories about the land. He showed me where a lightning strike had split an old pine tree 20 years ago, and where his kids had built a tree house that had long since rotted away. As the sun began to set, we made our way back toward the house. "You did good, Marcus," Harold said as he prepared to leave. "This land deserves an owner who will protect it. I am glad it ended up with you." After he left, I stood in my driveway for a long time, thinking about what he had said. Protecting the land. That was really what this had all been about. Not revenge against the HOA, not even the money from the easement. It was about standing up for what was mine and refusing to let anyone take advantage of me. Winter came early that year. By November, we had 2 feet of snow on the ground. I bought a snowmobile of my own, a nice Polaris that I used to explore the back portion of my property. The irony was not lost on me. The whole mess had started with snowmobile tracks, and now I was the one riding through the snow. One Saturday morning, I was out riding when I noticed fresh tracks crossing my property from the National Forest side. My first instinct was anger. Someone was trespassing again. But then I followed the tracks and realized they belonged to a deer, just an animal passing through. I laughed at myself. Not everything was a conspiracy or an invasion of my property rights. Sometimes a track was just a track. Christmas came and went. Jake came up from Billings to spend a few days with me. We went snowmobiling together, and I showed him the property boundaries and explained everything that had happened. He was impressed by how things had turned out. "You know what is crazy?" he said as we sat by the fire on Christmas Eve. A year ago, you were worried about a $1,500 fine. Now you have got 200 grand in the bank and you are the guy who took down a corrupt HOA president. Life is weird, I agreed. Are you going to stay here, or are you thinking about moving? I am staying. This is my land. I fought for it and I am not going anywhere. Good. You belong here. As January rolled around, bringing another year, I found myself thinking about the future. The easement money had given me options I did not have before. I could travel. I could invest in starting a business. I could do a lot of things. But what I really wanted was to keep improving my property and making it into the kind of place where I could see myself living for decades. I hired a contractor to build a workshop on the back portion of my land, near where the snowmobile tracks had first appeared. It felt like a symbolic gesture, turning the place where all the trouble started into something productive and useful. In February, exactly 1 year after Deborah had shown up at my door with that manila folder, I received an invitation to attend a Pinewood Ridge HOA meeting. George Walsh had personally written a note asking me to come and speak to the homeowners about the importance of property rights and community cooperation. I almost declined, but then I figured it might be good to show there were no hard feelings. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse on a cold Tuesday evening. About 30 residents were there, along with the new HOA board. George introduced me and gave a brief overview of what had happened the previous year. Then he invited me to speak. I stood up, feeling slightly awkward, and looked at the faces in the crowd. Some were familiar from the court proceedings. Others I did not recognize. I am not going to stand here and lecture anyone, I began. What happened last year was complicated and messy, and I know a lot of you were caught in the middle. But I do want to say this. The reason I fought so hard was not because I wanted to hurt this community. It was because I needed to protect what was mine. Property rights matter. They matter to me, and they should matter to all of you. When the HOA overstepped its bounds and tried to fine me for something I did not do, it forced me to look closely at how the HOA was operating. What I found was troubling, and I am glad it eventually led to reforms. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. I know the easement cost was a burden. I know the special assessment was not easy for anyone, but the alternative was for me to just accept being taken advantage of, and I was not willing to do that. I hope you can understand that. There was a moment of silence, then someone in the back began clapping. Others joined in. It was not enthusiastic applause, but it was genuine. George stood up and shook my hand. After the meeting, several residents came up to talk to me. Patricia Brennan thanked me again for helping expose Deborah's fraud. Robert Henderson invited me to a poker game the following week. A young couple with a baby told me they had just bought a house in the development and were happy to hear about the reforms. Driving home that night, I felt something I had not expected, a sense of closure. The anger and frustration that had driven me for so long had finally dissipated. I had stood up for myself, fought for what was right, and come out the other side. That was all anyone could ask for. Spring came, bringing new life to the land. I planted a garden near the house, something I had been meaning to do for years. I also started volunteering with a local land conservation group, helping other property owners understand their rights and responsibilities. In April, Richard called to tell me that Deborah's restitution payments had started coming through. The HOA would eventually recover most of what she had stolen. It is a good outcome all around, he said. Justice was served and the community is better off. Thanks for everything, Richard. I could not have done this without you. That is what lawyers are for. And hey, if you ever run into another property dispute, you know who to call. I laughed. Let's hope I do not need to. But as I hung up the phone, I realized I was not afraid of future disputes anymore. I had learned something important over the past year. When you stand up for yourself, when you refuse to back down in the face of injustice, good things can happen. It might not be easy and it might not be quick, but it is worth it. The snowmobile tracks that had started everything were long gone, melted away with the winter snow. But the impact they had was permanent. They had revealed a corrupt HOA, secured my financial future, and taught me the value of fighting for what is right. As summer arrived and the Montana landscape turned green and lush, I often found myself standing at the back of my property, looking out over the land I had fought so hard to protect. The access road cut through the southern edge, a permanent reminder of the easement agreement. But it was my land, clearly established and legally protected. No one would take advantage of me again. One evening in June, I was grilling on my back deck when I saw a snowmobile in the distance, far back on the National Forest land. For a moment, I tensed, old instincts kicking in. But then I relaxed. They were not on my property. They were not my problem. I flipped the burgers and thought about everything that had happened. The fine, the discovery, the standoff, the negotiation, the lawsuit, the criminal investigation, the trial. It had been exhausting and stressful and sometimes frightening. But it had also been necessary. Sometimes life forces you into situations where you have to choose. Do you stand up for yourself, or do you let people walk all over you? I had chosen to stand up, and while it had not always been easy, it had been worth it. The HOA had tried to fine me for snowmobile tracks I did not make. They had not known those tracks crossed my land. And when I discovered they had been crossing my land without permission for years, I revoked their access. It was that simple and that complicated. Looking back now, I would not change anything. Well, maybe I would have discovered the easement issue before the HOA fined me. That would have saved everyone a lot of trouble. But then again, maybe it needed to happen the way it did. Maybe Deborah needed to overreach so badly that it forced everyone to finally see what she was doing. Either way, it was over now. The HOA was reformed, Deborah was in prison, and I had my land and my peace of mind. That was all I had ever wanted. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I raised my beer in a silent toast to property rights, to standing up for yourself, and to the snowmobile tracks that had changed everything. Life was good. My land was secure, and I had learned an important lesson about the value of fighting for what is yours. The HOA had tried to fine me into submission, but instead they had awakened something in me. A determination to protect what was mine, no matter the cost, and in the end, that determination had not just protected my property. It had exposed corruption, reformed a community, and secured my future. Not bad for a guy who just wanted to be left alone to enjoy his 5 acres of Montana land. The burgers were done. I took them inside and sat down to eat, looking out the window at the land that stretched behind my house. My land. Hard-won and well protected, and that made all the difference.